So today we have our speaker from Harvard University, Ekdeep Lubana. He is a research fellow at the CBS NTT program at Physics of Intelligence at Harvard University. He did his PhD, I think it's a joint program with New Michigan and Harvard. And he's interested in this phenomena related to controlling and aligning neural networks, and has done a lot of interesting works about understanding neural network behavior, like conditional generalization, so in context learning. Please.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to talk about today is a series of works that I've been pursuing over the last 2 or 3 years on the dynamics of concept learning and how it may help us possibly explain emergent abilities in neural networks. So when I say emergence, primarily I'm referring to this phenomenon this rather intriguing phenomenon that neural networks often exhibit, where as you scale up the model pipeline, and scaling up here can mean different things. For example, you might scale up the number of parameters in your model. You might scale up the amount of data your model is trained on. Or you might just scale up the amount of context. So like at inference time, you provide the user more compute and you let them just exemplify via some exemplars more and more the behavior that they want to elicit out of the model. And you find that by scaling up the pipeline, capabilities that the model was not engaging in, that seemingly were inexistent at smaller scales, they start to show up after some critical scale. So this specific phenomenon is going to be the driving force for the agenda for today. We want to explain how these capabilities which suddenly show up but do not seemingly exist at smaller scales, how does this phenomenon transpire? And this is not just for scientific curiosity. Like just last week at NACL again, Mike Lewis, the head of pre-training at Meta, he was mentioning how emergent abilities continue to be like a bit of a pain for them when it comes to like both evaluating models as well as figuring out how much resources to put in for pre-training. Because if a capability is going to just suddenly show up, you can easily underestimate or overestimate the amount of compute that was needed for getting the model to have that capability in the first place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the work that we've done on this topic. I'm not going to focus at all on the model scaling aspect and focus primarily on data scaling and context scaling. Model scaling is something that we've only recently started working on. So we have some results. I'd be very excited to talk about that offline. But I'm going to directly first focus on the data scaling. Primarily, I'll provide a summary on the approach, just try to exemplify the approach I often try to take in my work. And then for the bulk of the talk, I'll focus on context scaling. Okay, so in regards to the approach, for the most part, I like to follow this kind of like physics/natural science approach, where you have some target system, some complex system, which exhibits some rather intriguing phenomenology, but the system itself is rather complicated to study. So what you might do is you try to identify some model systems which exhibit similar phenomenology, but they're simple enough that you can actually poke at them, you can experiment with them, they're amenable to precise experimentation. So for example, fruit flies are often used as a model system for understanding navigation in human brains. Based on whatever experimentation you might conduct, you develop some phenomenological models which help you identify the relevant control variables which dictate the system's behavior. And using that, you try to develop that phenomenological model, then becomes fertile ground for developing a predictive theory of how the system exhibits the behaviors that it exhibits. So let's see how this exactly transpires in a specific setting. So in a work that we did in Europe 2023 with a bunch of really exciting co-authors of mine, we developed like this. We had this very simple hypothesis that when capabilities suddenly emerge by just training on more data, possibly one of the models here that might explain this is compositionality. So basically, assume that you have to order some product from Amazon. So you need to have the ability to open a web browser, go to Amazon, perform a search for the product, find the relevant product, put in credit card details or something, hit the buy button. There's a series of steps that you need to follow, and if you fail at even one of those steps, you fail at the broader task. So there's a multiplicative dependence on each individual involved concept, and if you fail at those concepts, the ability to perform those actions, you fail at the broader task. So taking this to heart now, let's develop a simple synthetic setup, a simple model system which has similar structure. So here I'm going to focus on like a text-to-image diffusion model. What's going on is you have like a simple 3D coordinate system where each axis corresponds to a specific concept. So here this is the change of shape, along this axis size changes, along this axis color changes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to train from scratch a simple text-to-image diffusion model where the conditioning here will be the coordinates. So 0, 0, 0 implies a large red circle, a 1, 0, 0 implies a large red triangle, and so on. And I'm going to plot, as the model is trained, how well does it achieve, if I at inference time ask it to produce images from these classes, how accurately does it make them? So when you look at the learning dynamics for the scene classes, these 4 classes that the model was trained on, the learning dynamics are relatively continuous. Things are looking as we expect. But now we can go slightly out of distribution. Because this is a synthetic control setup, you can actually like design precisely defined outer distribution settings over here. So here what's happening is that the 1 implies that at least one concept needs to change with respect to the scene combination of concepts. So for example, the large blue triangle compared to a large red triangle requires a color change. And over here, now what you see is that the learning dynamics, around about 1,000 steps, there's like a slight kink in where the learning dynamics, like they show a change of slope. And this happens more or less around the region when the accuracies for the ability to generate images from the scene classes starts to saturate. But then you can go further outer distribution, and like now you require further compositions to happen. And that's when you start to get like really fascinating learning dynamics where the learning curves keep on getting sharper and sharper. And you can like just take this to heart and like just define more and more concepts. And like literally in the paper we have a toy model which will give you like a step, kind of like a step like learning curve.
So, what is your training procedure? Are you just like measuring 3 different metrics over the same ROM, or like?
Mm-hmm. So here, what we're doing is we have linear probes which are assessing after the model has produced an image, which are checking whether the color is right, whether the size is right, and whether the shape is right. And then it is doing a multiplication of these 3 concepts to get the final measure of like how accurately the model produced the image that it produced. And like to emphasize, this is exactly what you want for it to happen, right? So if you have to make, let's say, a small blue triangle, what we find is that if we decompose and like just check the model's ability to get the shape right, the size right, and the color right, you see that the shape and size are like relatively being learned in a continuous way, but the color shows this like a really fascinating kind of like a limiting reagent dynamic where like it does not end up getting learned until the first 2 have been learned, and then like suddenly color starts to get learned. And because of this, what happens is that until this point, the model is only able to produce small red triangles. But once the color dynamics start to improve, you eventually will get small blue triangles out. So if you were to add up these 3 measures, you'll actually get like a relatively continuous learning dynamic. But it would not be faithful with respect to the task that you're trying to perform, which requires, for example, for the model to produce a small blue triangle. And that's why you need a multiplicative dependence on the concepts.
Okay, thank you.
Not about the metric, but more about just the training. What's the training objective in your optimization?
Yeah, so this is a standard text-to-image diffusion model. So like it's going to be just a reconstruction loss of the training data. Okay, so what this says right now is that the concepts themselves, which are involved in the composition, they kind of like really are the right granularity if you want to characterize the learning dynamics, because they dictate how the progress of how the model is progressing towards like going outer distribution and showing novel abilities. So to the extent that we want to analyze how emergent abilities occur, the right kind of order of granularity would be to look at a concept level. So this leads us to our second paper, where what we did was define a very simple idea of a concept space where as the model is producing images, as the model is going through training, I'm going to like stop it at different checkpoints and ask it to produce images corresponding to different compositions. So here, rather than having, I'm going to remove the axis of shape and only have a size and color axis. So the x-axis is color, y-axis is size, and the model will be trained on these 3 settings. So 1, 0, large blue circle, large red circle, and small red circle. And for 1, 1, which is a small blue circle, I'm going to see if the model generalizes. And I'm going to plot the learning dynamics for both 1, 0, which is a scene class, the class model sees during training, and outer distribution learning curves as well. We identified, as I was showing you before, that color is the last thing that the model learns. It's kind of weird. Why would color be the last thing? Like, why not size? Why not shape? As it so happens, it's a function of the training data. We could identify something we call a concept signal in this paper, which allows us to control which concept the model learns first. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but I'd be more than happy to talk about it afterwards. Okay, so these learning curves that I'm going to plot, what I'm doing is at every checkpoint, I'm asking the model to produce an image corresponding to, let's say, 1, 0, or in the left panel. And when the concept signal for color is low, for example, these blue curves, what you can see is that the model first makes progress parallel to y-axis, so it learns about size first, and then it starts to learn about color. So the concept signal really allows us to control whether color is learned first or whether size is learned first. Because when the concept signal for color is high, you see that the model first tries to learn about color, and then it starts to learn about size. And the learning dynamics are relatively continuous. The model is directly trying to go towards 1, 0. But now when you look at the outer distribution class, that's when the learning dynamics start to get really fascinating. So over here, when the concept signal for color is low, the model again makes progress parallel to y-axis, learns about size first, and goes to a class which is most similar, essentially, offers the most rich signal corresponding to 1, 1, and that's a small red circle. But then when it reaches nearby red circle, it has this weird turn, and it starts to go towards producing 1, 1, small blue circles. It's kind of like a benevolence thing, right? Like the model didn't have to do that. It's fit the training distribution. It could just stay there. And you can get similar learning curves out as well if you have the concept signal being very high. So whatever fascinating thing is happening over here, or for whatever reason the model is eventually learning to go outer distribution and compositionally generalize, that has to be happening somewhere around these sudden turns. So our hypothesis was this is the part where the model disentangles the relevant concepts of the data generating process. And these concepts are ideally, most likely, they're going to be represented in subspaces in the broader representation space of the diffusion model. So what you can do is you can go to the bottleneck layer of the diffusion model and just see if you can easily identify linear interventions which allow you to manipulate these concepts around this point. If that's the case, then what that implies is that the model is learning to decompose the relevant concepts into two subspaces. And after that, it is basically just aligning the instructions to those subspaces. So let's see if that's the case. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these seeds, one of these concept signal values, so this is 0.2, so low signal values, and I'm going to take 5 runs, so 5 different seeds, and naively prompt the model to produce a small blue circle. What you see is the model, 3 of these seeds, they fail to do that, and 2 of the seeds eventually succeed, and these are generations from one of these failed seeds. So you get small red circles out. But as it so happens, if you can very easily identify linear intervention in the subspaces in the representation space, for all these 5 seeds, you can actually get the model to produce a small blue circle. It was just that if you prompt it to, it does not do that. So it's kind of like the model is competent, but it is not performing well when you ask it to. And people often kind of speculatively say this, that generative models might have more capabilities than we're able to elicit out of them. There's a simple toy setting where we're able to actually exemplify that.
There's a lot of different types of linear interventions. Would you elaborate on what?
Yeah, totally. So basically what we did was we took 0, 0 as a representation. So we put in 0, 0 in the input, extract a representation out, 1, 0's representation, and we just take a diff of that. And that's kind of the color direction. We do the same for 0, 0 and 0, 1. That's the size direction. So what you can do is you can take the color direction and just put it on 0, 1's representation, and that should ideally give you 1, 1's ideally should produce 1, 1.
And do you add on those vectors with the same amount for each of the 5?
Yeah, each of the 5, yeah.
Okay.
So individual seeds, where just the representation comes from the seed itself, not from a different seed. But yeah. It's also kind of fascinating that all of these show this sudden turn at exactly the same point. Well, okay, not exactly, but in a fairly close enough region. So there's some consistency to diffusion model training. People have commented on this a lot. It's unclear still why this happens, but again, in this very toy setting, we're able to capture that as well. And based on all this, now that we have a pretty decent phenomenology established, we know okay, what are the relevant control variables, this concept signal, and the ability to characterize the learning. We have a decent idea of what kind of learning dynamics lead to these certain learning curves. Now we have the fertile ground for doing a theoretical analysis. So in this recent paper, we had a Reichler. As it so happens, we showed that you don't need any of these interesting or slightly more complicated concepts like shape, size, color. A simple data structure with a mixture of Gaussians, where the Gaussian centers are centered at precisely defined hierarchical structure, where basically it follows the concept graph I was showing you over here. you can get the exact learning dynamics that I was showing with the more complicated settings out in this very simple setting. But because it's simple enough, you can actually perform a gradient flow analysis. And that reproduces the, like a theoretical characterization reproduces the entire phenomenology that we were getting out of the more toy synthetic system.
Can you explain what is WIJ?
Yeah, like it's going to be like a bit of a detail to get into the whole thing. But basically, what's happening is we have a two-layer MLP model where the first layer is trainable, the second layer is just like a plus half minus half initialized, and the WIJs are the weights of the model that have to be learned. AI and AJs are the correlation, the data correlation between the centroids of the 4 clusters that we're training on. And you can have like multiple clusters, so I and J, and hence are the ith and jth cluster. And what happens here essentially is that the learning dynamics are dictated by 2 terms, where the first term controls, it's kind of like an attraction term that the data is trying to attract the model towards itself. But then there's like a repulsion term, which is the second term over there. And that like the interplay between these 2 terms, like to begin with, at initialization, 1 term dominates. Then the second term becomes like higher in magnitude, and that starts to dominate. And then eventually they have to balance out, and that is where the compositional generalization ability emerges. So yeah.
So okay, for the part of parameter that you're training is like a linear model with some like nonlinear feature.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So yeah, that was kind of like something that I wanted to just show a broad summary of our data scaling work. The idea here being that like we start off with a simple system, a simple toy system which captures the phenomenology we want to explain. But then you start to analyze, once you have that system, you try to analyze the learning dynamics of that system. And based on the phenomenology that you establish, you try to use that as fertile ground for doing a theoretical characterization. This is a trend that I try to follow in a lot of my work. So on the first side, we had this whole compositionality hypothesis. We've done some other work as well, where, for example, we show a percolation like a phase transition like a percolation on a bipartite graph can actually be made to transpire in a language modeling setting where we have a context-sensitive grammar, and the model has to learn a simple knowledge graph. And it turns out that as a function of the scaling of the knowledge graph size, you can get because in percolation theory, we know how the transition point for percolation scales as a function of the graph size. As it turns out, the model's ability to learn the grammar's rules actually scale up in the same mechanism, in the same order as the percolation phase transition. So I can talk about this in detail as well eventually, but this is just to summarize that we've done quite a bit of work on this thread now. Okay, so getting into the main parts that I wanted to talk about today, this is some of the more recent work that we've been exploring on context size scaling. So you simply scale up the context size, and the model behavior can be made to change quite drastically. And over here, unfortunately, performing this analysis is much more complicated because in the data scaling or the model size scaling, people had done a lot of work in the past, empirical work showing what kind of tasks show certain learning curves. It was unclear what tasks here can show certain learning curves. To my knowledge, when we started doing this work, there was only one paper which had shown some interesting phenomenology, where like simply putting more and more exemplars led to the model like suddenly learning a new task, and for smaller context size, it wouldn't do so. So what we did was we first had 2 papers which were just like trying to get such learning curves out, in context learning curves out. So like no model is being trained, you're simply putting a bunch of data corresponding to some data generating process and getting the model to like simulate that process in context. Now, even though I'm really excited about the first work that's written up over there, I'm going to directly get into the second paper over here, which was a recent paper we presented at Eichler. And if you notice, the paper title is In Context Learning of Representations, where the acronym is also Eichler. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take a very simple graph, some lattice structure like graph. So here it's just a grid. I'm going to take some concepts which can be expressed in a single token. So apple, bird, car, and just put them on the nodes of this graph. Now I'm going to take a random walk on this graph and just put that random walk into a pre-trained off-the-shelf language model. So this is going to be like a Llama 3.1 8B model. I'm not going to tell the model that there was a random walk on a grid. I'm simply just going to say apple, bird, milk, sand, sun, and so on. And then I'm going to check what the model's next token probabilities are. If the model somehow figures out that there is a grid and we're doing a random walk on that, then its probability should only be focused on egg, plane, and mango, let's say if the walk ends at opera, right? So it should only focus on the valid next token neighbors, or valid neighbors in the graph. And that's what we're going to plot over here. We're going to take the valid neighbors as probability, sum it up, and call that accuracy. And you see that as a function of the context size, which is the walk's length that we feed into the model, you see that and also as a function of the graph size, there's a critical amount of context needed such that before that, the model basically randomly chooses any token. But then once you end up at that critical context, there's a sudden change and the model's ability to get the next token prediction according to the graph structure suddenly starts to increase. And eventually it saturates at 1. This point actually scales in a very nice power law with square root scaling manner. And we have some theories to explain how that's happening. I'll get into that in a second. But basically the idea here was that this very simple task already starts to show these sudden transitions that we were trying to capture. And now we want to explain why this is happening. So let's first do a very preliminary analysis and see at a representational level what might be happening. Because we never told the model there's a random walk being performed or there's a grid structure or anything. The model truly just has to infer this in context. So possibly what might be happening is that the representations might be reflecting the graph structure. So to that end, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take, again, just the same graph, perform the random walk, and I'm going to plot 2 metrics, the accuracy as I was plotting it before, but now this metric called Dirichlet energy, which is simply like the adjacency matrix of the ground truth graph. We take the representations from the model as a function of the random walk as it is going in. I'm going to take the representation of the last few tokens that are in the walk and use that to define the representation of these individual nodes. And then I'm going to plot on the right-hand side over here the 2D PCA, and over here I'm going to take the distance between the representations of these concepts and use that to define kind of like an empirical adjacency matrix and check whether the empirical matrix and the ground truth adjacency matrix, they're similar to each other or not.
Good question. So there should be an information theoretic limit on when this is learnable. How does that, have you looked at?
Yeah.
Does that correspond to your kinks?
Unfortunately not. The information theoretic limit requires assuming what the algorithm is going to be for gathering said information. So for example, if you simply look at the relevant statistics based on just what I've offered you in the context, so kind of like a simple memorization kind of solution, like a simple copying solution, the sample complexity of that versus a general algorithm, which is what I presume you're asking about, information theoretically, how many pairs need to be observed before you can infer the entire graph structure. Both of those are going to be, so the information theoretic one is going to be substantially more sample efficient because by default, the model doesn't know what to do.
It's as efficient as it could be.
Exactly.
I guess another question would be if you just take your context and compute bigram statistics.
Yes.
Right? How well does the bigram model of the context do?
Yeah, the bigram statistics, we have that as a baseline in the paper, and what you'll find is that the model turns out to be substantially more sample efficient than the bigram one.
Really?
Yeah, and it's kind of like a fascinating thing. It seems to be the case that the model is making implicit connections, but the bigram statistics wouldn't allow that by design, because bigram will only allow copying. So yeah, I don't have a perfect theory for why that's happening, but this is just something fascinating that we observed. Yeah. But to clarify what's going on with these results, so as we're going through the walk, we're plotting the 2D PCA of the representation, and you see when the energy hits its minimum, the graph structure itself starts to get reflected in the representation. Eventually, it just keeps on expanding, and that's bound to happen because once you fix on a direction, you just keep adding a vector along that direction, so the magnitude will keep on increasing. And that's also why the energy starts to increase eventually because the metric is not scale invariant. But it's kind of fascinating because what this implies is that in context learning, basically what I'm saying is in context learning works, but this is going a step beyond and saying model representations are extremely flexible. You can change the semantics of a concept, right? To begin with, the model used to think that apple and mango, which are both fruits, the representations were highly similar. But as we went through this random walk, the representation of apple and mango, they start to go very far away from each other. Now the model thinks, according to its representations, that apple and bird are more similar to each other. So you can in context learn like novel concepts essentially.
So just to double check, you have like different this graph for each example.
No, this is just a single graph.
A single graph for all example.
Yeah.
And this the PC you're plotting is the embedding measure of different context sets for the same example, or it's throughout training, or like throughout different training size.
So this is all at inference. There's no training because it's entirely in context. And the second thing is that let's say I feed in a random walk of length 100. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some window behind that. So let's say the last 20 tokens. And whatever, let's say Apple occurs twice. So I'm going to take the Apple token and like take the representation and average that.
So you have a window. So
exactly.
I guess my question is like, yes, if something does not appear, what do you do with that?
Yeah, so then we take another walk
Okay.
and use that to define the representation for that.
So, how do you know that it's not just copying?
Because the copying sample efficiency, because we can actually write down that algorithm, right? Like copying is a pretty simple algorithm that you can write down, and turns out that the sample efficiency for that is substantially worse than the model's sample efficiency for performing this task. At a high level, at least, that's one thing. Second thing would be that like the representations don't need to change in a copying solution. The model is directly affecting its representations to perform this task. And we have like actual causal evidence of that too, because if we start perturbing the representation, the model's ability screws up. It cannot perform this task anymore. Okay, and just a quick aside, this task actually emerged from a paper we were reading from Tim Behrens' group on cognitive maps. So you can actually take human subjects, take a random graph, and just like show them images of different concepts. And as they're looking at these images, just keep taking fMRI scans of their brain. And if you do a simple low-dimensional visualization of their the fMRI recordings, you can actually pull out the graph structure from the fMRI recordings themselves. If you ask the individuals, they actually don't know that they have changed the representation. There's some representational change happening in their brain. But you can easily see how you can perform this task with language models as well. Just rather than showing images, you can just say the word. Rather than saying showing an image of ear, you can just say ear. So that's how this whole transpired. Okay, so now we have a task which is simple enough. It shows us pretty interesting phenomenology. It shows us like these kinks where like suddenly the transitions happen between model behavior. So what we want to do is going back to the philosophy we were trying to follow before that, okay, we have a task, let's design a model system which captures the phenomenology that the task exhibits, and then use that to ideally try to use that as fertile ground for eventually doing some theoretical characterization. So what I'm going to argue here is pretty simple, that when you have the task that we were showing you is simply a Markov chain, right? Like you have a simple Markovian random walk happening on some ground truth graph structure. So what you can do over here is take that to heart and define a simple setting where you have capital N Markov chains that will define your training data. I'm going to, at every iteration of training, sample one of these chains with some prior, and then sample sequences from these chains. And I'm going to train the model using simple next token prediction on the sequences sampled from these chains, every iteration.
So each context is one chain.
I'm going to use chain for as a term for the process itself, so Markov chain itself. And each context is a sequence that I sample from each chain. So I just use the Markov chain to sample a sequence of some context length.
So I pick a Markov chain and I sample from it to get a sequence, and then I look at my prediction.
And then I first train from scratch a transformer on those sequences.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So this is now we're trying to train from scratch to see if we can capture the phenomenology I was showing you guys before. Okay, and at evaluation time, what I'm going to do is take a chain that the model may have seen before during training, so one of these N chains, or a novel chain that the model never saw during training. I'm going to sample a bunch of contexts or sequences from this inference time or evaluation chain, and then look at the model's next token predictions for these sequences. Once I have the model's next token predictions, because I have the ground truth transition matrix of the chain, I can just compute the KL between the model's next token predictions and the ground truth chain, and use that as my measure of whether the model is simulating that Markov chain accurately or not. At inference time for a novel chain that the model never saw during training, if the model is able to perform that task, That's going to be like our measure of outer distribution generalization, that the model is able to actually simulate novel chains that it never saw during training. So just to give away the main result, turns out that the phenomenology is substantially more rich than what we were observing with the pre-trained language models. We see that there are three main control variables which lead to this fascinating phase diagram where each color over here corresponds to a different algorithm that the model ends up learning for performing this task. I'll explain in a second what the algorithms are, but to emphasize, as a function of the context size, as a function of the amount of training that the model goes through, and as a function of what I'm going to call basically data diversity, or the number of chains in the mixture that the model sees during training, you find that there are transitions between the model in the model's behavior. The model might start off with an algorithm that is being represented here by a green color, but then like very suddenly transition into this blue colored algorithm. And as a function of context size as well, you can have a transition in the algorithms. As a function of training, you can have a transition in the algorithms, and so on. And despite its simplicity, to my knowledge, literally all known results on in-context learning could be captured by this single setting. Generally, when you have in-context papers on like understanding in-context learning, they focus on some specific phenomenon and try to exhibit that. As it so happens, the simple setting actually captures all of them in a unified manner. So to the extent that we want to perform a theoretical characterization of in-context learning, this becomes a pretty fertile ground for doing that. Okay, so what are those solutions? Now, if you think about a Markov chain, good.
Are these algorithms like complementary, like are these contradictory to each other? Like, what's the basic settings of these, like switching between the algorithms?
Yeah, I'm going to show the whole thing to clarify that. Okay, so if you think of a Markov chain, there's primarily two kinds of statistics that characterize any chain. It's unigram distribution, a stationary distribution, or it's a transition matrix. So basically, if I were to sample a sequence from it, what are the bigram statistics of that sequence? So what I'm going to do is, I'll take some chain, sample a sequence from that chain. I'll compute the histogram of the token seen in that chain. So that's kind of like just the frequency of the individual tokens. And I'll plot the frequency of the bigrams. So that's something that you can think of as kind of like an empirical transition matrix. And I'll just simply compute a distance of these histograms or the transition matrix with respect to the ground truth chains that the model sees during training, and just compute the distance with respect to them, use that distance as kind of like a weight and perform a simple weighted average. So you can think of this as Bayesian, kind of like a Bayesian model averaging with a discrete prior on the chains that the model sees during training. And using that, it turns out that you can find 4 solutions. So specifically, the model averaging based with a discrete prior, we're going to call that a retrieval-based approach. So the model goes to the chains it has seen during training and retrieves the most relevant chains and does a weighted average of that. And the way that you do the weighted average, which can be either based on unigram statistics or based on bigram statistics, that'll define our solutions unit retrieval or bi-retrieval. In the meantime, the model may not actually look at the training data at all. It might just completely ignore the training data and only use the sequence offered in the context to make its next token prediction. So that's what I'm going to call unigram-based inference or bigram-based inference. These two approaches, you can expect they will generalize pretty well outer distribution because they don't rely on the training data. They don't rely on what the model saw during training. So this is the kind of like expectations we can pre-register, that if a bigram-based retrieval approach should generalize extremely well in distribution because that is the base optimal solution that you can have, but the outer distribution performance should be pretty bad for this solution. Meanwhile, a bigram-based inference approach should have more or less the same performance, similarly unigram-based inference, and unigram-based retrieval should kind of be really bad outer distribution and okay-ish in distribution. So those are speculated solutions. We don't actually know whether the model does that. Those are just things we can speculate that the model might be doing. So let's see if the model actually does that. I'm going to perform 2 kinds of tests to assess this. First, I'm going to check whether the model is using the bigram statistics. If you have a sequence and you compute the next token prediction, and you simply shuffle that sequence, you break the bigram statistics, but you preserve the unigram statistics because unigram statistics will be order invariant. So if the model's next token predictions do not change under a shuffled sequence, that implies the model is only using the unigram statistics. So like, does the model use a unigram versus bigram? That like this test will help us characterize that. And then second will be a proximity to retrieval test. This is slightly complicated to explain, but like at a high level, what's going on is I'm going to look at the model's next token prediction. I'm going to use that sequence to actually manually write down like a Bayesian model averaging approach based on the the discrete prior over the scenes chains, and then I'm going to do the same thing but using a set of chains that the model never saw during training and compute the distance with respect to these. So I'm just going to compute the relative distance of that. So just take the ratio with respect to the seen Bayesian model averaging solution and like an unseen Bayesian model averaging solution. So this gives us an approximation of like whether the model has a preference or a bias towards the seen chains.
Does it not work to just take each of your models? Each of your models is going to have a prediction that that model would make.
Mhm.
Right? So you could just do a KL
Mhm.
to each of those models and your trained model.
Yeah, but you do need a baseline with respect to which you want to estimate that, okay, is the model, because like eventually you'll just get a number out of the KL, and like the KL numbers might be low enough, but you want to check that, okay, with respect to like something that the model never saw during training, are these numbers close enough? Because if they're close enough, then that implies the model does not have a preference towards something it saw during training. So that's why we need like an unseen thing.
Right, I'm just thinking the KL divergence is,
Yeah.
is in all settings would be a reasonable metric.
Yeah, so eventually I'll get into a different project where we did exactly what you're thinking. This was kind of like our first time doing such a project, so yeah. Okay, so this is what the bigram utilization test looks like. As a function of training and as a function of data diversity, the number of chains that a model sees during training, you find this rather fascinating, rather quick transition that occurs from using just the unigram statistics to using not unigram statistics. I'm going to call these bigram statistics because I know eventually that I can show that it's bigram statistics, so just bear with me for a second and assume that it's bigram. So what's happening is that once you have gone through enough training, the model starts to use the bigram statistics, and early on in training, it only uses unigram statistics to to compute the next token prediction. And this exact point is basically when the induction head forms. The specific, because when you have to compute bigram statistics, you need a relevant attention head which can go back and refer to the previous tokens and then compute what the next token should be, so that there's an architectural constraint. At initialization, the attention is uniform, and until you have the induction head, you can't perform bigram computation. Then we look at the proximity to retrieval test, and what you see is that as a function of data diversity, when the diversity is too low, the model has a preference towards memorizing the chains that it is seeing during training. So that's why the retrieval score is pretty high. However, as you keep on increasing the diversity, the preference switches over to performing the inference-based approaches. However, if you keep on training, eventually the model starts to memorize the chains that it is seeing during training. So despite its preference for an inference-based approach, the retrieval-based approaches can take over eventually. And to be clear, like this boundary over here, it's kind of like a logarithmic boundary. So we don't actually know if we kept on training more, whether this just keeps going to infinity. Like it's plausible. I'm just mentioning this because when I show this plot for the first time, people often think like maybe it's just some memory capacity, like it's a capacity constraint. The model does not have enough parameters to just fit all the chains into its parameters. I'll again show some results eventually, which will counter that capacity constraint-like claim.
How big is your model?
This is a two-layer transformer model with a 128 embedding size. Okay, so now we have these two tests. You can just take a simple Cartesian product of them. So based on the statistics the model uses and the approach, retrieval versus inference. So and just see that, okay, what solution has the most dominant weight. So a unigram-based inference, a bigram-based inference, a bigram-based retrieval, and a unigram-based retrieval. And these are still not perfect depictions of whether the model follows these approaches. This is still suggestive. So what you can do is, because these are simple enough, you can actually write down these algorithms procedurally and compute their next token predictions. You have the actual model's next token prediction and just check the KL between them. And that's what we see over here. So unigram-based inference has pretty low KL, exactly in the region that we expected it to. The bigram-based inference, again, has pretty low KL, exactly in the region we expected it to, and so on. And so this kind of like now grounds us that, okay, we had these four solutions that we speculated, but turns out exactly that is what the model ends up performing. And now this is where the colors were coming from, the four colors that I was talking about. I also want to just quickly mention over here that like often when you see papers on in-context learning, they'll say in-context learning works in X way or Y way. I'd argue that like you cannot actually make that statement. In-context learning generally is just like an umbrella term for like a bunch of algorithms that the model might have learned as a function of training, and it just depends on which phase you're in if you want to characterize the phenomenology that you'll witness as a function of these different hyperparameters.
There's been other work that's demonstrated that like models can run multiple algorithms simultaneously.
Yeah.
Is there anything here to rule out that being the case? I'm kind of
no, there's evidence for that. So what happens is, if you stay with me for 2 slides and I'll show you something.
Thank you.
Okay. So okay. Now, once we have these algorithms, you can kind of like do a simple functional decomposition of the model, right? There's no necessity to do this, but we just wanted to see exactly how the transitions happen here in the model behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the model's next token probabilities and just decompose them as a simple linear interpolation between the algorithms that we identified, the next token probabilities of those algorithms. And to the extent that this holds, to the extent that we're able to perfectly explain model behavior as a function of all the different hyperparameters, what this implies is there's kind of like a competition between these different algorithms to dictate the model behavior. Because there's a constraint here that they need to sum up to 1. And this is how those plots that I was showing you before, the 3D phase diagram, were made. Basically, you associate a specific color with each of the algorithms. You find those weights, and the sum of the weight times the color value. And if the weight is only 1 for a specific algorithm, the color will primarily be dictated by that algorithm. So that's how you get these phase diagrams out. And the fun thing here is regions like this. There's kind of like, for any physicists in the room, it's kind of like a triple point over here, where there's phases that coexist. There's different model behaviors which coexist. And to answer your question, what happens is you can actually decompose the model parameters to identify that there are certain parts of the model which correspond to like performing just one algorithm, and there are certain parts which correspond to a different algorithm. So it's kind of like a competition of circuits thing. Okay, so now that we have these weights, you can actually characterize the learning dynamics according to the values of these weights. So what I'm going to plot over here is for a decently high data diversity, so 2 to the power 6, when we see for the first time these regions, these transitions from a green to a blue to a red, so unigram-based inference to bigram-based inference to bigram-based retrieval. So what happens is that when the first transition occurs from uni-inf to bi-inf, that's when the induction head forms. So as soon as the induction head forms, the model transitions to performing a bigram-based inference approach. But because there is always memorization going on, essentially the learning dynamics for memorization is just not fast enough. It is taking its time, but eventually the model will start to sufficiently memorize the chains that it is seeing during training, and then the bigram-based retrieval approach will take over. So there's like a nice crossover that occurs between the 2 algorithms. And this also starts to explain essentially what people call transient nature of in-context learning, where the models can often solve novel tasks in context, but if you just keep on training them long enough, they start to lose that ability, and they can only perform tasks that they saw during training. Like novel sequences from the tasks that they saw during training, they can perform decently on those tasks, but they cannot just learn in-context novel tasks. And what we were seeing before, when the diversity is low, the blue phase doesn't quite show up, which is the bigram-based inference phase. So what happens over here is, again, when we look at the weights, you see that by the time the induction head was supposed to emerge, the model has already memorized enough. So once the model has the ability to compute the bigram-based statistics, the bigram-based inference approaches cannot take over because the model has memorized enough, so it just directly goes into a retrieval-based solution. So it's just a persistent competition between like the circuits formation, learning like the right kind of architecture, the induction heads, for example, versus learning to memorize. These dynamics are almost independent, and our collaborator, who I will mention on the next slide over here, Gautam Reddy, he actually performed a pretty decent gradient flow analysis for a different setting, where he showed that actually if you make that assumption, you can perfectly characterize the phenomenology of in-context learning that we were showing in our paper. So these are like 2 parallel papers submitted to ICLR together. However, what we showed in this paper that we are about to put up very soon with a bunch of really fun collaborators, Noah Goodman and Daniel Burgraft, that you can actually develop a pretty solid predictive model for all these phase diagrams that I was showing you before. So what I'm going to do now is, as we just talked about, that the memorization learning dynamic versus learning how to model the statistics, the architectural thing, are independent. So you can just remove the statistics reliance and focus on a task which is a simplified version of the Markov chains. In the interest of time, I won't get into very much details of like what this task is, but basically you just don't need the bigram statistics. Simple unigram statistics suffice on this task. And what I was calling retrieval before, I'll now call a memorizing-based predictor. And what I was calling inference before, I'll call that a generalizing predictor. And turns out, using these two algorithms, you actually can reproduce in the simplified setting the phase diagrams that I was showing you before, that when the diversity is low, the model does a retrieval or a memorizing-based solution. When the diversity is high, the model tends to perform a generalizing-based solution. And as a function of training, you have transitions from generalizing to memorizing. And simply performing a simple Bayes rule calculation and assuming three things: scaling laws hold for neural networks, a simplicity prior, that models tend to prefer simpler solutions, where simplicity is something we actually formalize here in the language of standard algorithmic information theory, and that you can actually approximate stochastic gradient descent as a Bayesian learner. You get out this pretty simple equation, or maybe not so simple, but where what's happening is that the difference in the complexities of the algorithm and the amount that they're able to explain the data, so the difference in the loss that the perfect predictors, when implemented, would achieve, these two values, they help you identify which algorithm the model will eventually converge on. So you can compute the log posterior odds of, after training on some data set S, which algorithm will the model learn. And this simple equation actually reproduces the phase diagram I was showing you before. Not only does it reproduce, if you were to give a novel sequence to the actual trained transformer, the next token predictions that the model has versus our theoretical model, they perfectly match. So that's what this heat map over here is. Okay. In the interest of time, I'll quickly rush through the slide. But what I was just saying, there's the simplicity bias of the model. If you have to memorize too much, the model prefers to go for a generalizing solution as a function of training. The likelihood term, that what explains the data better, takes over. And hence, if the likelihood is larger than the prior, then the posterior odds prefer to go for a memorizing solution. So this is just like a predicted phase diagram, and what we saw before matches the prediction. Okay, so to broadly conclude, we saw that concept learning in context or via pre-training, concepts that underlie the data learning process can lead to sudden learning of capabilities once the model disentangles what the relevant concepts are in the process. And once you start composing these rules, that is generally what leads to these sudden learning curves. I talked a lot about data scaling and context scaling. Model scaling is something we are actively working on right now. Again, happy to talk about that offline. And just quickly to emphasize something that what I'm exploring these days, some of the ongoing work that I'm pursuing focuses mostly on phenomenology of human-AI interaction now. Previously, we focused a lot on phenomenology of AI itself, what kind of capabilities it exhibits, how do they emerge. But now I'm starting to focus a lot more on the other side of the lens, because these models have just gotten really, really good. But traditionally, we used to think of humans as being more capable. It's kind of controversial, but I'd argue models just have gotten really good, and there are definitely scenarios that they are better than at least I am. So the first question that that brings up in my mind is it possible that as I interact with the model, that starts to update my opinions on certain topics? What relevant information would the model have to capture about me if it has to do such a thing? So with a bunch of exciting authors, cog-sci and psych people at Harvard, we started exploring this. And we, for example, took a very first jab at this recently. A paper will be submitted to NeurIPS next week, which was focused on emotion prediction. So we took this theory from psychology on a hierarchical structure of emotions, where people kind of just speculated in psychology this theory that how different emotions relate to each other with this hierarchical structure. This is often called the emotion wheel. And turns out just from the model's probability predictions, you can actually redesign such a hierarchical structure. This was a pretty cool result because you don't actually need the model's internal representations. You can just essentially follow a standard algorithm for defining a Bayesian network by looking at the probability dependencies and use that to elicit a hierarchical structure. And the second fascinating thing was we needed a large model to do this. Smaller models do not reproduce this hierarchical structure. So there is a benefit of scale over here, that larger models are able to identify more fine-grained emotions and identify the structure between them. And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to go away from the work that I've been doing in the past. So I'm still continuing that thread as well, trying to understand models better. one of the recent approaches that people have been thinking a lot about is sparse autoencoders to, for like in an unsupervised manner, try to extract concepts from model representations. Personally, coming from a disentanglement / causal representation learning community, I wanted to like first tell the community that there are certain identifiability challenges that you'll face if you start using sparse autoencoders. So this was a paper we presented last week in NACL. And we've now done a theoretical characterization that if you define a specific architecture, what specific concepts are you able to elicit out of a model's representations? And based on this theory, which was supposed to primarily be more focused on showing negative results, we started realizing actually we can produce positive results and produce novel architectures for designing sparse autoencoders. A paper that was just recently accepted to ICML on vision autoencoders, vision sparse autoencoders. And these architectures are actually starting to do meaningful things for us. For example, we were in a collaboration with this really prodigy of an undergrad at Stanford. We were able to elicit a lot of challenges with off-the-shelf diffusion models where we find that, for example, models just really have a hard time producing images with white backgrounds. Unclear why, but in an unsupervised manner, we can identify a bunch of concepts like these that diffusion models really have struggles with. We're trying to do similar studies with language models now, where previously we focused on diffusion models and vision, but now we're trying to reproduce similar experiments by using stories as like a benchmark for doing model interpretability. And I'm also trying to operationalize. I love doing science, but ideally science should inform practice. So a lot of the science work that we've done in the past, we're trying to collaborate with the AI Safety Institute in the UK to operationalize the compositional model of emergence I was talking about before for developing better reporting standards for model capabilities. These are all my collaborators who helped me, and thank you so much.
Great talk. Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing about kind of the work you did on trying to characterize what in-context learning is doing is it's very convincing for cases where you need to learn something genuinely new, like a Markov model. But it feels like a lot of the times what in-context learning is really doing is amplifying some underlying skill from the pre-training data. And in that case, it might be drawing from things that are basically more examples than just two, right? Like the diagram is not sufficient. Like, do you think that this kind of bears on that? Or like, how do you think we should go about thinking about more complex tasks that probably the in-context examples aren't sufficient to learn, but clearly models can perform them because they're relying on training data?
Yeah, so it turns out the final results that I was showing on this, like, kind of like a Bayesian model for in-context learning, that actually holds in context itself. And so what you're saying that like models retrieve kind of a task that they've learned via pre-training, you can think of that as the model prior, the pre-training prior. And the data that you offer in the context, if that data is not explained by the pre-training hypothesis, like the hypothesis the model has learned, it has to truly in context infer the hypothesis when the long-term memory does not suffice.
Sure.
So like just to give a quick example of that. Okay, so here what's happening is we know days of the week they kind of like are circular in nature. And actually people have shown that if you take model representations for days of the week and you simply do a 2D PC of that, you get a 2D circle out. Now what I can do is I can just define a novel days of the week. We go to a different planet where days of the week don't go in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday fashion. Let's say they go in this Monday goes to Friday, goes to Tuesday, goes to Saturday, Wednesday, Sunday, Thursday, Monday. So it's again a circle, but it's a different circle. And when you embed a circle in a circle, you get a star. Now, what happens is that if you look at the model representations by doing a kind of like not a random walk, but like just following this new days of the week pattern, you find that if you feed in these sequences into the model, the first two components still reflect the original days of the week circle, but the next two components actually start to reflect the structure we were imposing on the model. So the model kind of like augments its representations to actually have both the in-context structure as well as the pre-training structure. And I'm pretty sure if we just kept continuing, that we eventually had hit compute limits because we had this academic resources. But if we kept continuing, we can probably get the third and fourth component to become the dominant two components. And at that point, the model will actually follow our preferred order on the days of the week.
Sure.
So the point here being that like for most of those analyses on like retrieval-like behavior of in-context learning, the contexts are very small, I think. If we have a large enough context, we can update model behavior and make the model prefer the in-context hypothesis, where it truly has to learn something new from the context.
Yeah, I mean, no, I definitely agree with that. I think the only thing that like scares me a little bit is a lot of the times, like I definitely agree with sufficient data, your theory will hold. But most language model behavior is not asymptotic. It's actually on very little data. And so then you have some kind of complex, ugly prior. And since you don't know what's in the prior, you don't really know how to predict that, right?
We're working on that too, actually, for predicting priors.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I can talk about that. But that's what Eric actually had a quick look. So, yeah.
So,
A question that's maybe not fully well defined, but maybe also relates to what you're just showing here. So in the examples you had earlier, like in I think the third paper, where first was doing unigram statistics and then later was doing bigram statistics. Do you know if you look at the representations, do you think it's still counting unigram statistics once it switches to bigram statistics, or does it just totally stop that algorithm?
It has totally stopped that algorithm, and the reason I can say that is because when you look at the attention heads, to begin with, the attention heads are kind of like they have a uniform pattern, so they literally just compute the frequency, they compute unigrams. But the attention heads then completely change. The attention structure focuses on computing the bigram statistics. So the unigram information is not even present anymore. However, when you have a very tiny context, there isn't just enough information, so that's the only moment when the pattern looks sort of uniform, and that's when like the model does something like unigram statistics. But that's mostly because when the context is too small, whether if you were to compute bigram or if you were to compute unigrams, the model behavior is going to be more or less the same. Like a bigram-based retrieval or unigram-based retrieval will more or less be the same.
Question following that question. So if you train to predict the next token at different positions in the same sequence, like you should, I would expect like to see like transition between the predictors.
Yeah.
Right. But do you think? The first question is, have you done such experiments? And second thing is, do you think that's
Let's do many slides. Okay, yeah. On the the z-axis over here, this is actually in context. So this is happening for a given sequence in context where we are going from. Okay, this is average over a few sequences, but like as you're going through the context length, you're computing the next token probabilities of the model and just comparing them to
so this is not like
values.
training for different examples.
These two are training axes. This is an inference axis. This is entirely inference.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
Right.
I'm curious more on the human AI aspect. Have you drawn any parallels from the emergence of theory of mind in humans, and like how is it comparable to the theory of like emergence in these models?
That's a bit of a broad question to answer very quickly, but basically I'd argue like what we're currently focusing on is that what is theory of mind? It's a very abstract term, right? Pragmatics in general is a very abstract concept. So what we need to do here is kind of like follow this compositionality approach and like decompose in the reverse side, decompose what is theory of mind. When people talk about theory of mind, what kind of skills are they referring to that the speaker has to model about a listener? So emotions, for example, are one thing. We've started looking into like persuasive dynamics, that when you persuade someone, what kind of latent variables of the listener's model, like what kind of model do you have to make for the listener? And as a function of scale, as a function of model size, what specific sizes do you need? What kind of configurations do you need for those latent variables to be modeled by the language models? So I wouldn't say like that's a very satisfying answer, I'm aware, but like the idea here being that we are starting to see effects of scale on these more abstract properties rather than standard benchmarking of like, let's say MMLU performance or something. And I think like this is going to be more meaningful as we start deploying these models, because we need to know what exactly are they capturing about us, like what, and to that end we need to like start defining better what do we mean by things like theory of mind, Gaussian principles and all that. What exactly are they? Yeah.
In terms of the this kind of like switching algorithms thing, this is something else that people have talked about with grokking. So there's a story in like the grokking literature that if you have this weight decay, that you sort of prove these like memorization algorithms. Do you see anything like that happening? Are you using weight decay? Like, what's the?
And there's no weight decay here.
Okay.
Also, like, even in grokking literature, like, I think like actually, Zivan has a paper on that too. That like a simple NTK based theoretical analysis can actually elicit grokking. So basically, you don't need weight decay. It's kind of a matter of whether the model is in the lazy regime and then like suddenly switches to a feature learning regime. And that happens for a specific set of hyperparameters, like the data needs to follow certain conditions. To emphasize, however, the grokking models won't hold for us because we are in an online learning regime. Grokking implies that you're in offline learning, like a batch learning regime, where you have the ability to fit the training data. We don't have that ability because every iteration of training, I'm going to sample a new, fresh batch of sequences, and the model is being trained on that. So the models of grokking won't help us explain any of the phenomenology that I'm demonstrating over here.
So you did, in your analytic formula to predict phase transitions, you had a simplicity term. But you then said that you weren't doing shrinkage.
Yes.
So
yeah, what is that?
What's up?
Thank you for asking that. I'm very excited about this project, actually. Okay, so what's happening here is I'm gonna, because these are predictors that I can manually write down, procedurally write down in code, I'm gonna write these down and then run a bunch of compression algorithms and use that as an approximation of the algorithm's inherent complexity. So it's kind of like in information.
You're literally taking code and
compressing that.
Compressing it.
Yeah, so and that turns out to be predictive of a trained transformer's behavior, which is still like, I don't know how to wrap my head around that, but like for 3 very different settings where like the metrics, everything is very different, we are able to reproduce all this. We have about 6,000 different settings, and this consistently keeps on checking out.
So one could argue, maybe you would argue, that there's an implicit bias in transformers toward compressible algorithms.
I would argue there's an implicit bias of the learning pipeline rather than just the architecture. But yes, there seems to be a non-trivial role by the architecture. Yes.
I'll have to try to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, I'm also doing that right now.
So on a previous slide, you had kind of talked about how the 4 different algorithms have different generalization properties. Doesn't that suggest then that if you can predict the phase dynamic without actually training the model, that like if you want it to be out of distribution, then you like I think that the just so story is that like you should be able to predict like, okay, I want these hyperparameters or such.
Yeah, and you can do that, definitely. I'd argue like this is very much in the regime of like, all this results on μp and like how we should initialize a learning rate for our model, how we should initialize the model weights themselves to get most, to be able to take smaller models, identify the best hyperparameters over there and how they should be transferred to larger models. Like when you do such scaling analyses of like how these transfers happen, that's exactly the goal, that eventually if we have predictive theories, we should be able to predict for some setting that I've never run a model on, what the right hyperparameter should be to get the behavior that I want out of it. I wouldn't say we've achieved that yet. We have a predictive theory of what's going on with these simple settings. So if you wanted to train for whatever reason, let's say a model on Markov chains, I can definitely tell you what the right hyperparameters are, but you probably don't want that. So there's few more steps needed before we end up with something more realistic and something more useful for language model producers.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we are running out of time. Let's thank the speaker again for the great talk.